You wait here. Kaixo, arratsaldeon guztioi. Eskerrik asko gaur ere museora hurbiltzearren. Atsegin handia da niretzat, gaur Guggenheim Bilbao museoaren erakusketa berri hau aurkeztea. Lisboan jaio eta nagusiki Frantzian bizi izan zen Helena Vieira da Silva artistari eskainitako erakusketa hain zuzen ere, espazioaren anatomia titulopean, erakusketak bere ateak irikiko ditu aste hontako ostegunean eta ikusgai izango duzue otsailaren 22 arte, hurrengo urtera arte. Esan beharra dago eta agian zuetako batzuek ikusiko zenituen, baina 2021 eta 2022 artean, urteen artean, Vieira da Silvaren 3 artelan zoragarri ikusgai egon ziren hemen museoan beste erakusketa baten testu inguruan. Emakume abstrakziogileak erakusketaren baitan 3 artelan zoragarri izan genituen ikusgai. Hala ere, oraingo hontan, benetan izango dugu aukera artista honen lana, ibilbidea eta hizkuntza artistiko hain pertsonal hori era sakonago baten ezagutzeko erakusketa antologiko honen bitartez, eta nolabait arreta berezia emango diogu berak artista honek espazio arkitektonikoan zeukan interes horretan. Y efectivamente, pues es un gran placer, me complace muchísimo presentar hoy aquí. Lo hemos hecho esta mañana ante los medios y ahora ante vosotros esta nueva exposición dedicada a la artista franco-portuguesa Helena Vieira da Silva, titulada Anatomía del espacio, y que abrirá el próximo jueves, pasado mañana, y que podréis disfrutar y visitar una o varias veces hasta el 22 de octubre del próximo año. Y decía que ya hemos tenido ocasión de disfrutar o de contemplar algunas de las obras de Helena Vieira da Silva. Sucedió en el año 21-22 en el contexto de otra exposición que se presentó en el museo, Mujeres de la Abstracción, pero que efectivamente en esta ocasión podremos conocer en profundidad el arte, la trayectoria, ese lenguaje artístico tan personal que caracteriza la obra de Helena Vieira da Silva, prestando una especial atención al interés que ella tenía, ese destacado interés que ella manifestó por los espacios arquitectónicos. Y no me quiero alargar más porque hoy la protagonista es aquí mi compañera Flavia Friggeri, comisaria de la exposición, a quien agradezco en nombre de todo el equipo del museo por su gran labor como comisaria al frente de esta exposición, y también aprovecho para felicitarle por su reciente nombramiento como directora curatorial y de colecciones de la National Portrait Gallery en Londres, y le agradezco que esté hoy aquí siendo consciente de todas las obligaciones a las que tiene que atender. La doctora, y paso a presentarla, seguramente muchos ya conocéis quién es Flavia, pero para aquellos que no hayan tenido ocasión de adentrarse en su trayectoria, la doctora Flavia Friggeri es la comisaria de esta exposición, como decía. Actualmente es la directora del área curatorial y de colecciones de la National Portrait Gallery de Londres. Anteriormente fue Curator Chanel en la misma institución, donde dirigió un importante proyecto de colaboración respaldado por el Fondo Cultural Chanel. De 2016 a 2020 fue profesora de arte moderno y contemporáneo en la University College de Londres, y anteriormente fue curator de arte internacional en la Tate Modern, donde co-comisarió la exposición The World Goes Pop en 2015 y organizó también las exposiciones Henri Matisse The Cuts Out, Paul Klee Make Invisible y Ruins in Reverse, todos en el 2013 y 2014. Recientemente ha sido comisaria invitada de la retrospectiva de la artista franco-portuguesa Helena Vieira da Silva en la Peggy Guggenheim Collection de Venecia, de la exposición colectiva Beyond Form, Lines of Abstraction 1950-1970, en la Turner Contemporary de Margate y de All Art Today's, una muestra de arte contemporáneo internacional en el Mare de Bucarest, en Rumanía. Ha publicado artículos y ensayos en catálogos sobre el arte italiano de la posguerra, el feminismo, la historia de las exposiciones y el arte pop. Es la autora de los títulos Pop Art y Women's Artists, ambos pertenecientes a la serie Art Essentials de Thames and Hudson, y coeditora de un volumen de ensayos escogidos, New Histories of Art in the Global Post-War Era. Todo eso. Quería además, sabiendo, y nos lo ha contado la propia Flavia, cómo ha discurrido este proyecto colaborativo con Carol Bale, directora de la Peggy Guggenheim Collection en los últimos años. Carol no puede estar hoy aquí, pero quería también agradecerle muy sentidamente por esta colaboración, por su labor al frente de la Peggy Guggenheim Collection, que es un museo amigo con el que trabajamos muy habitualmente, y también para la organización de esta exposición, que primero fue presentada el pasado verano en Venecia, antes de que haya por fin venido a visitarnos a Bilbao. En todo caso, cedo la palabra a Flavia, que es a quien habéis venido a escuchar. Eskerrik asko, muchas gracias.
Thank you, Miran, and thank you to the entire team here in Bilbao who have been wonderful on this journey of bringing the exhibition here. And I also wanted to take this opportunity to thank the representatives of who have been looking after the artist's legacy and estate and who are with us tonight. And obviously, the work you've done is very much, over the years, the backbone to a lot of what I've done in bringing this exhibition together. So I wanted to use this opportunity to thank you. But without any further ado, I'm going to take you through a visit of the exhibition, a virtual visit, in preparation for your real visit. And, you know, as Miran suggested, the show is going to be on for a few months, so please do come back. Vieira da Silva is an artist who deserves to be looked at in detail over and over again. So you're in for a treat, if I may say so myself. But I wanted to start this presentation with the photograph that for me was so important along my journey of discovery of Vieira da Silva's work. When you start as a curator to look and research an artist, there's always moments, sometimes it's an article, sometimes it's a photograph, that click, that make it work for you. And this photograph was, for me, the moment. I obviously already loved very much Vieira da Silva, but it did something for me. And I knew from the very get-go it would be the cover of the catalogue, and I'm delighted everyone agreed with me in Venice and Bilbao, so you'll find it on the cover of the catalogue. And what I love about this picture is it shows us Vieira da Silva in her space. It was taken by the photographer Denise Colombe, and she is in her studio in Paris. And the studio was such an important place for Vieira da Silva. You know, very often we say artist studios are places of making, but for some artists, the studio is not just a place where they make. It's, in a way, their world. And for her, the studios were very much her world. So that's important. She's surrounded by the objects she likes, but also she's surrounded by her works. And so in a photograph, you get everything. You get her works, you get her place, that's so important, but also you get this beautiful layering of two of her faces. And I think layering is something that is very present, both formally but also conceptually in a lot of her works. It's never just what you see, there's always a layer beyond that she's inviting us to look at. So for me, this was a very meaningful starting point. And you'll see it at the entrance of the exhibition. The other really important part of the story that I tried to make sense for myself from the very beginning was her relationship with her husband, the artist Arpad Chenet, who was Hungarian. The two met in 1928 when Vieira da Silva moved to Paris. So she was born in 1908 in Lisbon. And from a young age, she had an interest in art that was very much encouraged by her family, who were culturally very aware. She traveled with them, she visited museums, she had for a long time the memory of visiting the National Gallery in London as a young child. And also she had access to a library in her family home with plenty of books and art books. So she was very aware of art and very visually aware from a very young age. But she had two passions. One was art and the other one was music. And when, the time came to make a decision, she decided, obviously, given we're showing her paintings, to go for art. But music remained a great passion throughout her life. And she began her art studies in Lisbon. But like many artists of her generation, and think this is the 1920s, she felt that Paris was the place to be. And so she convinced her mother, who was very supportive of her passions and very supportive of her endeavors, to move to Paris. And in Paris, she enrolled in the Académie de la Grande Chaumière, which was a favorite amongst artists of her generation because of its education, which was quite liberal, unlike other academies. And it was there at the Académie that she met Arpad Chenet. And they sort of locked eyes at the beginning. It took a few years before they properly met. But they were together for a lifetime until his death. And, very often when we think of an artist couple, we've been so used to the rhetoric of the man overshadowing the woman. This was not the case. In fact, if anything, she was the most successful of the two, and he was very supportive of her work. And so for me, it was really interesting to start the exhibition by acknowledging this relationship, but also acknowledging the role it played in her life and in her work as an artist in terms of the support it provided her and the safe space it provided her. But also it was an opportunity to bring into the exhibition the portraits, which, as you'll see, there's only these ones. She's a very abstract artist. So it was also a way for people to meet the artist before you see her work. And so what I would love is for people to have her in mind, and especially this beautiful self-portrait, which to me is so beautiful. Her expression and her piercing eyes, it just captures it so precisely and so finely that I like the idea that it accompanies you throughout the visit to the exhibition. And in this section, there's two more works which are very significant in introducing her and her art. And one is on the left of the screen. You're seeing a portrait that was painted by her husband. And it shows Maria Elena work. And he often painted her throughout the years. And what this painting does for me, it really shows us her technique. And, he said that she worked feeding the canvas little by little. And here you can really see that level of detail that really translates in a lot of the works you're going to see in the show. They're done with a remarkable precision. And that precision comes from this dedication that she places in making each work. And sort of opening the exhibition, but very much speaking to this portrait of Maria Elena, is this painting called The Tiled Room, that was very much, in a way, sets out her ambition. It's one of the earliest works, and it tells the story. It's the beginning of her journey, and it's the beginning, in many ways, of her engagement with abstraction and with a research around the idea of space, to which I'm going to come back to in a minute. But what's fabulous about The Tiled Room is it shows you how her work is about space, but it's also about movement. It also draws on a number of different inspirations, and over the past few days I've been showing around lots of journalists and speaking and being asked who was she influenced by. And the answer is she was influenced by lots of people and none at the same time in many ways. She was influenced by, the checkerboards of Bonnard's covers in his paintings, table covers. She was influenced by Cubism, she was influenced by Futurism, but she took all of these influences and very much made them her own. And in this painting, she's showing us a space that's very vibrant. It's not a still space. We tend to think of space as being very still. Her work is very much about space being animated. And we also see the influence of something that comes up over and over again in her work, and this is the tiles. And, as someone who was born and raised in Lisbon, and even when she was an adult and at that point lived in Paris, spent extensive periods of time in Lisbon, the azulejos that very much were part of her visual frame of reference continued to inform and to some extent shape the idea around these works and their forms. So this is how I welcome you into the exhibition. And from there, and this is also part of this section, and it's actually a portrait that she painted of her husband, Arpad. And I just love that his jumper is in many ways like a reflection of the style of painting that she makes. So almost like his jumper is one of her paintings. And you'll understand as I show you more examples what I mean by that. And then we move on to what becomes very much the core of the exhibition and the story that I've set out to tell. And, one of the decisions you make when you start curating a show is you always need to decide what is going to be the focus of your show. And she is an artist who worked for many decades, really up until her death in the early 90s. And so there was a huge body of work to choose from. But one decision I made early on was to really focus on what were the key decades in which she was developing her language. And this is the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And it was during this time that you can really see the arc of the development of her abstract language. But also, I was mindful that for some people, she is a well-known artist, and especially those living in Portugal and France will have seen her work more often in recent years. But for many, she might be an artist associated with one particular style of painting, or maybe they're very new to it. And so in a way, assuming that we were opening this dialogue up to an international audience, I really wanted to get to the sort of core of what she was most famous for and most sort of interested in developing in the early years of her career. And one of such points is the idea of space. And space, sort of the development of her interest in space is multifaceted. So it stems from a visit she takes to Marseille early on with her husband, shortly after they were married. And she was very taken whilst being there by this new sort of technological feat, which was this drawbridge. And it was made of steel, and the impact of the lines of the structure, but also of the technological feat of this bridge really made an impression on her. And alongside this, she was also really impressed by constructions and sort of new dwellings that were being built. And this is a reflection of that. And what sort of fascinated her was the tension between the building that's being built and the scaffolding surrounding it. And the scaffolding, in many ways, is a ready-made abstraction. It's made of lines and perspectives. And that is something that she comes back to again and again, the line that forms the space. And the other really influential, and I would say, turning point in the development of her language is this exquisite work, which belongs to the Vieira da Silva and Arpad Foundation in Lisbon, and it's a painting of her studio. And as I said at the beginning, she was a creature of her studio, which was not only a place where she made works, but it was also a source of inspiration. So often throughout her career, she would paint her studios in different ways and forms. And in this early painting, what you really see is the bones of the studio. And I'm using quite intentionally the word bones because there's something anatomical about her relationship to space. as a young student in Lisbon, she was really taken by a course in anatomy that she took at the School of Fine Arts. And this course in anatomy, she was quite obsessive about it and very meticulous. She would draw over and over again the bones, she would study them, she would take them home with her so that she could study them more in the evenings. And what this built in her was not so much that this made her the greatest figurative painter, because she didn't want to be that. She wanted to be an abstract painter. But I think what it really built in her is an understanding of structure and the idea that in the same way that a human body is upheld by a structure, which is a skeleton, so do spaces. And spaces have their own structures. And so what she's doing here in this painting is she creates an image of the studio, but overlays it with this structure. And this structure, really interestingly, speaks to two works that are part of this section and that have a lot of resemblance in terms of forms and elements. And these two works are, again, very seminal in her story, but especially the one on the left is also quite seminal in the genesis of this exhibition, because it's a work that belongs to the Guggenheim collection in New York, so it's part of the bigger Guggenheim constellation. And it was acquired by Hilary Bay, who was advisor to Solomon Guggenheim. And she was an artist herself, which is important to mention because Hilary Bay bought this work shortly after it was made, so in the mid-1930s, making it the second purchase of Vieira da Silva's work. The first had been made by the painter Julian Trevelyan. And it's interesting that the first two people to buy works from Vieira da Silva were artists. And I think for an artist, having that support from other artists is everything. It means everything. And so this work that has been, part of the Guggenheim collection now for many decades was one of the sort of starting points also to think about Vieira da Silva in the context of the Guggenheim constellation. And the other, and this is a side note, but equally important, Peggy Guggenheim, when she curated her legendary now exhibition of 31 women, included Vieira da Silva. So even from her side, it was an artist that she was looking at and interested in. And we know that Peggy Guggenheim owned a work. Unfortunately, this work is now lost. And despite our best efforts as detectives, we haven't been able to find it, but maybe it will come up someday. You never lose hope. But sorry for the sort of digression, but it was quite important to contextualize also the relationship between Vieira da Silva and the bigger Guggenheim story. And so these are really works that start exploring this idea of space. And space you'll see is a leitmotif that I'll come back to again and again as we go through her works. But then we move into, the exhibition moves into the next section, which is maybe the section that has the works that people tend to be most familiar with when they think of Vieira da Silva. And these are the works of dancers, chess players, and card players. And to some, these might feel like, to some extent, the most decorative, maybe, although they're all but decorative works once you start really getting under the skin of them. And this is where I come back to that idea of layers. You might see this, and especially the work on the right, and think it's a very colorful work with cards. But actually every work for Vieira da Silva there's multiple meaning. There's the surface, but then there's also the deeper meaning. And the chess players that I have here on the left are a good example of this. One thing that Vieira da Silva was really drawn to when she was young is she visited, when she arrived in Paris, all of the museums, she went to all of the galleries, and she was really taken by the card players, Cézanne's card players. And it was partly because of the sort of composition and the structure of the composition, the fact that there are these two players who are playing virtually forever, because it's a game that will never stop given it's fixed on a canvas. But also there's something that it really triggered her to think about the meaning of things such as chess players and card players, which for her is also a metaphor for life, really. You know, as a player, you're only ever in charge or in control of your own actions, but your actions are always in response to someone else's. So in a way, it's also that dynamic of having to respond to life, and thus bringing into these works this sort of layer that is not just, you know, a nice picture, it also makes you think about the dynamics of life. So it's always very layered. And then one of the pieces that I was really excited to have in the exhibition is this extraordinary piece that belongs to MoMA in New York, and it's of these dancers. And dancers is something that she's really interested in. And she's interested in blending the experience of dance in these spaces. So the space that the picture I showed you at the beginning of the tiled room where you have the different tiles, and I told you it's really setting the space in motion. Here the space is set in motion by the dancers, and the dancers become one with the space, and the space becomes animated and in motion with the dancers. So there's this real interplay between the human body within space and that movement that's created in space. And it's really one of those works. Every work is really a work that you can get completely lost into. And so I invite you to spend time with them. And this is another iteration on these dances, but this time it's called The Riot of the Grids. And I love this title because it gives you a sense of also the grid that's sort of rebelling, that's coming apart, and all the lines sort of take ownership of the space in a way that's of their own. But also, if we want to really read into it, we can see in all of these lines those scaffoldings, those lines that very much inspired her when she went to Marseille and saw that building in construction. So there's many, again, it's all about the layers. But, you know, the moment of effervescence that some of those works represent comes to a halt, in a way, a sudden and unexpected halt with the outbreak of World War II. And obviously, you know, we now know what the outcome of that is, but at the time it was quite, you know, a disruptive event. And it was especially, she felt it very disruptive because on marrying her husband, Arpad Chenet, she had to renounce her Portuguese citizenship because at the time you couldn't have two citizenships. So she had become Hungarian by marriage. And he was of Jewish heritage, and understandably, they were quite nervous about staying in Paris. So they go back to Lisbon in the hope that they can succeed in gaining back her Portuguese citizenship and by extent pass it on to him. This doesn't happen, and so they make the very difficult decision to go on self-exile to Brazil, and they go to Rio de Janeiro. And this is for Vieira da Silva a very difficult time. He adapts quite easily to these changing circumstances. For her, it's difficult. It's difficult because of the weather. It's difficult because of the distance from her mother, who's back in Europe. It's difficult because of what is happening in Europe, and experiencing it at that distance, it's something quite traumatic and anxiety-inducing. It's also difficult because the opportunities to exhibit are fewer. You know, before she left for Rio de Janeiro, she was, you know, her career was really booming. It was starting to take over. So there's a lot of uncertainty that comes with this move. It's both political turmoil in the world, but also her own personal feeling about this all. But despite this situation, or maybe in light of this situation, she creates in Rio de Janeiro some extraordinary works. And to me, they're the ones that every time I see them, and I've seen them a lot at this point, I'm always really moved by them. And, you know, when we, you know, as a curator, you always need to think, why am I doing a show now of this artist? What still makes them relevant? And I think what she depicts during this time of great turmoil is what still makes her relevant. And I would like to draw your attention to the work on the right, which is, you should never have a favorite in an exhibition, but this is maybe one of my favorites. It's just such an extraordinary piece in terms of the power and the way it's made. For starters, it's a work that blends abstraction and figuration, which is something occasional in her work. It's a work that captures the idea of human tragedy, essentially. She is, in depicting the war, she's not depicting the Second World War, she's depicting human tragedy at large. And this is what continues to make these works really relevant. The figures become one with this wave that's basically, they're drowning and they're trying to survive at the same time. And it's an incredible, also in terms of colors. I mean, my slide doesn't really do it any justice. You need to go and see it in the flesh. It's an incredibly powerful work. But it's also a work that, together with these other two from the same moment, where the sea, the power of the sea is replaced with the power of the all-enveloping power of fire. It's a work that also speaks to another set of references and visual references that Vieira da Silva had, and specifically Renaissance painting. When she was young, in her early 20s, she went on a grand tour of Italy, and she really immersed herself in Renaissance art. She was already quite proficient in it, having been as a young girl to the National Gallery, having seen Renaissance paintings in Paris. But it's the work of Paolo Uccello that really struck a chord. And I think once you see it, you cannot not see it ever again. The Battle of San Romano and that representation, again, of conflict, and a conflict that's quite convoluted, and it's almost like a time lapse. Everything is happening in one scene and in one place. And so there's all these layers. There's a layer of the war, there's a layer of her own suffering, there's a layer of human suffering, but there's also all these references that come into play in these extraordinary paintings. So again, go and spend time with them. They're really, my description is only like, a detail, but there's plenty more to see. And then as a sort of slight juxtaposition to a section that can feel quite heavy, I've included a work that was also made at this time, and this is the Carnival of Rio, which obviously is infused with a completely different spirit. It's the spirit of the party, the celebration, but it's also the spirit of someone, I think it's done, obviously she's using that style that she adopted for the harlequins and the dancers, but it also shows the way she engaged with also the culture that she was experiencing and living with in Brazil. So for me, this was a really nice juxtaposition to also show how she's multifaceted. It wasn't just all doom and gloom, but there was also space for other types of works being made. And with the end of the Second World War, she returns to Paris together with her husband, and this is 1947. And this is the beginning of a very good period for her. She is extremely prolific. She's happy to be back in Europe. She has regained access to her studio, which had been taken care of up to that point by her very sort of close ally, the gallerist Jean Boucher, who had been supportive from the start of her career. And so Paris sort of is a new dawn in a way, but it's also the beginning of her gaining increased popularity. She will show at the Venice Biennale. She will have exhibitions all around Europe. So it's a happy moment. But it's also the introduction of new themes and new subjects in her work. And one of the themes that becomes really prominent at this point is a representation of cities. And cities will become a long-standing interest of hers. And obviously cities are spaces. They're the biggest spaces of them all, if you think about it. They're the ultimate urban spaces. And each city, she doesn't represent it in a naturalistic way, but she represents it through these layers. And in this case, it's the layer of feeling of what the city represents to her. So here there are two celebrations, both very French, and just to carry on the theme of the city, there is obviously Paris and Lisbon are the cities that she knows the best. They're the cities closest to her heart, and they're very present in her representation of cities. And these are two images of, the night city. I like to think it's also Paris, even though it's not made explicit, as in the case of the painting on the left. And it's the feeling of that city. And whenever I talk about Vieira da Silva's cities, I always think of Italo Calvino and his invisible cities. And if you've read the book, you can maybe guess where I'm going with this. It's a book where he tells the story of lots of different cities that are completely imagined, but actually have real elements in them. And I think this is what she does with her paintings of cities. She creates paintings of cities she knows very well, but she also paints cities that completely stem from her imagination. And it's an extraordinary body of work. This is another representation of Paris that we have in the exhibition. This is Venice, and you can see the water, the lagoon, the bunting. So you can imagine, you can see even from these ones that I'm showing you that even though they're all very abstract, there's some elements in each city that give you a sense of that city. And then there's this piece that gives you a sense of also the city being like almost like a tentacular. It's a monster. It's like huge, and to me, this also speaks in a way to another aspect of city living that I think she wants to really bring to our attention, which is also something maybe quite existentialist, which is very fitting given this is done in the 1950s, which is the idea of cities also being places of alienation for individuals. Cities are huge in many ways, tentacular, almost monsters that capture the individual. And so there's always, and this relates back to her representation of chess players and card players, there's always a layer in her work which is deeper. It's not just about the formal representation, but it's also meant to make us think about the realities, and in this case, the reality of the city. And tied to cities, the other aspect of her work that gains greater preponderance in the post-war years, it's the representation of more spaces, both exteriors and interiors. And this is a great piece that we have in the show, which is La Gare Saint-Lazare. And again, once you sort of know what this is, you can start imagining, the trains pulling in and out. The colors really give you a sense of a train station, the sounds. So in her representation of space, and this is where that anatomy, that interest in the anatomy of space, she constructs these places that are both real and imagined at the same time. And this work you'll find on a wall together with these other two pieces, which are also some that I really love. They are both construction sites. And this brings us back to Marseille and that early construction site that she was so drawn to. And here we can really see the idea of the building coming into being, a construction, again, that scaffolding, that ready-made, those lines, that abstraction that exists in space, it's real in space, but that can also become imaginary. And, in thinking about spaces, there's also a variety of spaces. There's spaces like this, the arena, which is very different in shape and form, but also very different in color palette. And this section really brings out, it's almost like it's almost like a rainbow of types of colors, types of structures and forms that she explores through spaces. This is another extraordinary work. And you can also see how her use of abstraction changes, and in some cases very much stripped down to some simple lines. In some cases it's much more decorative, and it brings us back to those tiles. It's more refined. So there's also a lot of variation in her idea of abstraction, which to me also makes her one of those artists that you keep discovering. Every work, in a way, it's a world of its own. And more, as you can see, there's plenty. And also plenty in terms of color scales and variations. The small work actually, the one on the left is quite a small work, so it's very detailed. And again, it sort of invites you to like look deep and hard. And, you know, even to me, I've seen these works a lot at this point. Every time I see them, I see something new. I see a detail. I see a choice of some blue details that she's using as a counterpoint to like a very bright and vibrant and yellow painting. So even her mastery of color is exceptional. And then, although I said the show really focuses on the 40s, 50s, and early 30s, 40s, and 50s with a bit of 60s, I felt it was important to make a nod to how her career develops, but also how her style evolves. And I brought this work, which is, again, an incredible feat of detailing. And in here you can see everything from doors to, it's another study of space of sorts. You can imagine doors, openings of all kinds. But also it speaks to another concern that Vieira da Silva had, which is around the idea of the labyrinth. And the labyrinth is another motif for her. So in the same way that card players and chess players had this existential undertone of the sort of like the chances and what happens in life, so do labyrinths. As a young girl, she got lost in a labyrinth, eventually obviously found her way out. Very good. So she wasn't traumatized by the labyrinth, but this experience made her think about labyrinths and the fact of having to find your way out in circumstances that are not always the most obvious. And so there's a lot of this thinking, and even though she I would say she didn't love speaking about her work, there's some really interesting interviews that give you a sense of the understanding, the underpinning that sits behind many of her works. And, you know, maybe she wouldn't be, in many ways, like most artists, she had this strong belief that the work should speak for itself. And this is what artists generally tend to say. But I think there's something quite beautiful in reading her own words and her own snippets of information, because you get a sense of the bigger picture. And the final section of the exhibition is, in a way, at odds with a lot of what you have just seen. So you will come to it as you come out of a section that's very colorful into a section that's very white, or shades of white, actually. It's not pure white. And this is because the color white was a very important color for her. It's a color that she always came back to. It's a color that didn't have seasons. Other colors for her had seasons. And it's a color that she came back to throughout her life, but most importantly, it's a color of light. And it's this idea, light, together with color more generally, is a very important theme in her work. And so what happens in this section, and it's very hard to describe it because you really need to be immersed in it, is a selection of works from different moments in her career and in her life that give you a sense of how she uses the shades of white and variations on the theme, but also give you a sense of how her style has evolved, how it has changed, how abstraction has changed for her, changed forms, but also changed in relationship to the color that she's using. And this is my last slide, again, from a great work in that section. And on this note, I want to thank you for listening to me. And if there are any questions, I'm very happy to take them. You can also ask your question in Spanish, and I can understand, but also helpfully I have translation has been provided for me. Thank you. And I see there's a few mics, roving mics. So yes, if you have questions, feel free to ask. Or if you don't, that's also okay. I would say the most important thing is to visit the exhibition. Oh, there it is.
Thank you. It was an amazing story about Maria. So as you were mentioning that colors were an important role and kind of a dimension in her art pieces, what do you consider was an inspiration, someone or something that was the most important to Maria?
I mean, it's hard to say because, and this is funnily a question that has come up a lot over the past few days, also with press. It's hard for me to say there was one inspiration because I think I wouldn't do her justice. I think there was a lot of inspirations of things she was interested in and drawn to. So she was interested in the work of Cézanne, in the work of Bonnard. She was interested, and she was someone that, despite spending a lot of time in her studio, she was very aware of what was happening around her. She wasn't the kind of lone wolf that was, just doing her own thing. She was interested in cubism. There's even one could say there's maybe even a metaphysical side to what she does and the way she thinks. But there's not one single thing that I can say, this is definitely what she was like, the one passion. I think it was lots of stimuli. It was music. It was space. When she had the opportunity to build her own studio, she made sure it was very open in a way that is reflected in the kind of spaces and perspectives that she's looking after. So I would say she was someone who absorbed a lot of different influences, and not all of them just necessarily visual and not just artistic, but there was a real spectrum. And one thing that I've now I'm very sure of, although probably maybe she would disapprove of this, is if she was working today and living today, probably her practice would be multidisciplinary. I don't think she would only do painting. I'm pretty sure she would do installation, be really interested in architecture. Like, she was already sort of pushing the boundaries of these things within the remits of what she had at the time. So I don't know if this answers your question, because it was like...
It answered more beyond what I asked. Thank you very much.
Yes, can you tell us how she worked in her studio? If she made drawings first, if she spent, I don't know, days or weeks on a painting, or she had many paintings at the same time working on?
So drawings wasn't a big thing for her. It was the first question I asked when I visited all of the foundations. I did ask if there were drawings, and there are some sketches of some ideas, but she worked directly on the canvas, and she worked on multiple things. But one thing I would say for me was, and there's a film, when you walk into the exhibition, there's a didactic space, and there's a film there. And there's one thing about that film that for me is a key to this question that you have, is the way the intensity with which she's dedicating herself to the canvas that she's painting in that film, the precision, the detail. It's something that you can tell that the moment she's working on something, that is her whole world. That is what she's doing. There's nothing else exists. And I think, that is a sort of it's real sheer dedication. The other thing is she was very, as far as I understand, this was a comment that I read made by her husband in an interview, that they were, I think he said that they were like bankers. They would go to a bank person. They arrive at 9 and they leave at 5. In the same way, they had very fixed hours, her and her husband. They were working in a very methodical way. But I don't know if this was a comment made in passing. Yeah, it's always quite funny to think of artists as like bankers or postmen, very square.
Hi. I'm very curious to why you have chosen the last painting.
The white ones.
The white ones, yes. That particular one.
That particular one, because it's different from, as I said, that room, you'll understand when you see the room. It's almost like variations on a theme. And that particular one, it's very flat, and it's almost like the tiles have become a lot more, inserted in a grid, it's almost like they've rejected the grid they came from. They're a different grid. It's flat. The perspective has completely been removed. But also it's like, what I like about that painting is there's so much variation in one color that it's extraordinary. There's a lot of white, but a lot of variation in white. So that was one of the reasons. But more generally, that room was, you know, when you curate a show, you start with some ideas, but there's a point where the ideas find you. And I would say that is the idea of doing a room of white painting somehow found me at one point. I was like, there's a lot of white in this show. It makes sense to make it. And it's also really unexpected. You wouldn't think that you come to the end of the show and it's just about one color. Well, probably I've exhausted you with a lot of words and a lot of information, too much, but I hope it was useful. And again, do go and see the show. And thank you all for coming tonight.